If you will focus your attention on the screen, Miss Angela has something here for you.
Okay. Hey everyone, so there's a session today at 2 in JPL study room 4, but more importantly, I changed 2 of my times and locations on my schedule, so Wednesdays and Fridays times have been switched, and Friday's location is now JPL study room 10. For Wednesday, they haven't gotten me a set location yet, so what will happen on Wednesdays is I'll just send out an email telling you where the location will be, and we'll meet outside probably the old JPL study room 4, and then move to the new location. And yeah, that's it.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Avail yourself of her expertise, be a good idea. Let's see, what are we doing today? We are finishing up with our look at this crisis with England. So let's start with this. Okay. All right. Last time we left off with the Boston Massacre, March 5th, 1770. Not much else is going to happen for the next couple years. It's almost like both sides realized how intense this conflict was becoming, and everybody stepped back and said, let's chill for a minute. There's going to be some small-scale skirmishes going on all across the colonies between the colonists themselves, different groups of colonists conflicting with the British Army. But it's all real small scale, nothing major's come along. The next big crisis point then comes in 1773 when Parliament passes the Tea Act. Now, I've got to give you a little background for this to set this up. Remember the Townsend duties, that, quote, external, unquote, tax on English-produced goods sold within the British Empire. Well, they repealed all of them, didn't they? Except for the one on tea. They left a 3-cent tax, 3 cents per pound tax on English tea as an assertion of Parliament's authority. So that's still in the background. We colonists don't care because we're smuggling in Dutch tea, which is already a little cheaper. Back in England, there's a corporation, a joint stock company known as the East India Company, or the EIC. The East India Company. The East India Company has a monopoly on tea sales within the British Empire. The East India Company has tea plantations in India where they harvest the tea, they ship it back to England, and then distribute it to other parts of the British Empire. Now, the way this normally works is that all of these colonial merchants would be able to buy tea from the East India Company, take it to their shops, and then sell it to their customers. By 1773, the East India Company is almost bankrupt because of our colonial boycott on English tea. We're not buying their stuff. And so the East India Company is just about bankrupt. Now, many of the owners and investors in the East India Company also happen to be members of Parliament. So they demand that the new Prime Minister, Lord North, do something to bail them out. So Parliament then passes the Tea Act of 1773. Now again, contrary to our American mythology that says the English kept taxing us and kept taxing us and kept taxing us, here's another example of Parliament actually lowering a tax for us. It lowered the tax on British tea down to 1.50 per pound, which is equal to the customary bribe. Parliament and the East India Company are thinking that we colonists now, since it's just as cheap, actually cheaper now, to buy the English tea, that we'll go legit. We'll buy the English tea with the tax, the government collects revenue, the East India Company stays in business, and all is well. Well, as soon as the details come out, it appears that this tax, even the English tea, is now cheaper here in the colonies than it is back in England. And that angers the British public. Again, England deep in debt, taxes really high in England, think that we colonists are getting a free ride. And so people back in England are not too happy about this. And there's riots in the streets regularly over parliamentary taxation. So they lowered the tax for us, thinking that they were doing us a favor. The colonists, though, when the details come out, are immediately suspicious. They're immediately suspicious of this for two basic reasons. One, if we buy the English tea and pay the tax, that is acknowledging that Britain has the right to tax us, something that we've been saying all along they can't do. The second thing that the colonists are concerned about is that this threatens free enterprise. It threatens the livelihood of many colonial merchants. Because the East India Company now will be the exclusive distributor of this English tea. So in every town, one guy will be appointed as the East India Company agent. And now you, if you want tea, will go to him and purchase the tea. The way it used to be is the tea would be brought in, an auction would be held, you, the shopkeepers, would buy tea from the East India Company and then take it back to your shops to sell to your customers. This now cuts you guys out of the picture. Now the East India Company agent is the one who's going to be making all of the money here. So it seems like another, to us colonists, like another attempt by Parliament to favor wealthy and powerful people back in England. And we get screwed in the process. So they're going to communicate their dissatisfaction. One of the ways that they do this, yes, they're going to communicate their dissatisfaction. One of the ways that they're going to do this is, of course, sending letters to each other, but they're also going to draw political cartoons. This is one of my favorite from this whole period. It's a primary source. It was created at the time by people who were connected somehow to this event. It's called Forcing the Bitter Draw. Now, what we have here is young virgin America, stripped half naked, defiled. And then here's Parliament holding her down, and Lord North is forcing tea down her throat. The British public is looking on with curiosity. The military is standing by to make sure that this is enforced. Here's Liberty. Liberty is so appalled by this, she can't bear to watch. She just has to turn her head. And of course, there's some British pervert here trying to look up her skirt. You can't quite see it in this scan, but right here, young virgin America is spitting that tea back into Lord North's face. She's not taking this. Now, this cartoon gets published in a variety of places across the colonies, and it builds this anti-British sentiment that's already been growing. Here's another example of the British trying to screw us. So in terms of mass communication, it's going to be pretty successful. Following this is probably one of the most famous events in this period, the Boston Tea Party. Now, the Sons of Liberty still exist. They've renamed themselves, though. They're now called the Committees of Correspondence. But it's the same group of guys, and they're still active. They've still been, since the Boston Massacre, since the Stamp Act, been stirring up this anti-British emotion. And they've been trying to come up with ways that they can protest the Tea Act. And they're going to try a variety of methods. They've sent letters back and forth saying, hey, we're doing this, hey, we're going to try this. In some towns, they send a ship out to meet the incoming tea ship and convince the captain to turn around and go back to England. Perhaps a threat of violence there, if necessary. In other places, the tea ships are landed. They're tied up at the dock, but the dock workers refuse to unload the ships. And the captain and his crew don't have the tools or the manpower to unload the ships, so the ship sits there full of tea, and this tea is starting to rot. Now, we've tried all of that stuff in Boston, and none of it's worked. So we're going to try some more drastic action. Late December of 1773, right before the tea is supposed to go on sale, Sam Adams, Paul Revere, a bunch of other guys in Boston who've been active, decide they're going to take some direct action. Now, this is going to be a mass type of protest. This friction between Boston and anything British has been growing still. The night before the tea goes on sale, about 40 guys gather at Sam Adams' tavern. They disguise themselves as Indians, and they start walking towards the docks. By the time they get there, there's an estimated crowd estimated of anywhere between 2,000 and maybe 4,000 people with them. So this involves a lot of folks. The crowd subdues the guards, and these committees of correspondence members board the ship, crack open 342 chests of tea, and dump it in the harbor. At the time, it was worth 10,000 pounds. Today's equivalent, roughly $1.5 million. So this isn't petty vandalism. This isn't tagging the gym at your high school. This is the wanton destruction of private property. The Sons of Liberty / committees of correspondence here are depriving the East India Company and its owners of their natural right to property. So there's some, well, inherent conflict in what they're doing versus what they're saying. Question?
Was it pretty easy to know that they weren't Indians by this time?
Everybody knew they were not Indians. The next morning, Governor Hutchison, the colony's governor, sends investigators out to find out who's responsible. And the investigators go to people's houses, knock on the door, and say, what do you know? What did you see? And most of them will say, oh, I wasn't there. I didn't see anything. And some of them say, well, I was there, and I saw who did it. It was Indians. It was Indians, I'm telling you. They did it. The Indians. Now, think about this for a minute. Okay, think about that. If I came to class on Tuesday disguised as an Indian, how would I be dressed? A headband with a feather in it, maybe. Some war paint on my face. Wearing a loincloth, God forbid. Half naked. I will not torture you that way, I promise. The point is, I wouldn't fool you, would I? You wouldn't walk in Tuesday and go, oh my God, there's an Indian teaching class today. You didn't know who it was. Everybody in Boston at the Tea Party knew exactly who did this. Nobody ratted them out. It was Indians, I'm telling you. Indians did it. Word gets back to England and Parliament is furious. Now, this episode, the Boston Tea Party, resonates through the rest of this period, and it resonates through later generations, including our own, as being this rather dramatic symbol of defiance of government authority. Even today, when people want to communicate that they're opposed to some government policy, they'll probably bring up this idea of the Tea Party because it's the symbol of resistance to authority. So now, word's gotten back to Parliament, they're furious, so in early 1774, they pass a series of laws known collectively as the Coercive Acts. Now, refer to your Guide to the Colonial Revenues document that I gave you, not necessarily now, but we'll just hit some of the highlights here. Coercive Acts. Parliament named it that because they intend to coerce or force the colonies to comply. This time, Parliament is really serious. So the Coercive Acts are going to do a couple of things. One, it's going to be aimed primarily at Massachusetts. It closes the port of Boston. No ships in or out. A city dependent on trade is now shut down until the tea has been paid for. Closes the port of Boston. No ships in or out. Boston can't make any money. Parliament says, we don't care how you raise the money, but the port remains closed. You're out of business until the tea has been paid for. So that's going to put a financial burden on the people of Boston and Massachusetts. there's going to be another piece of this, an unrelated law called the Quebec Act that's part of this. Quebec, Quebec. Quebec. Quebec, Quebec, I don't know, one or the other. It's a place in Canada. Okay. The Quebec Act gives French Catholics who are living in British Canada more control over their local affairs. At the same time, the coercive acts threaten or dissolve some of our local governments. The Quebec Act applies to the province of Quebec, gives French Catholics more control over their local affairs. At the same time, one of the coercive acts dissolves the Massachusetts legislature. No more Massachusetts legislature. We don't get to vote for representatives to help make the rules here in our colony anymore. Instead, the king and the governor and parliament will appoint people to make laws for us. So this is a clear violation of our long-standing privilege or right of local self-government. This does away with it completely. So the result here, one more thing, all of the trials of British officials accused of a crime here in the colonies will have their trials held back in England. Any British official commits any crime, instead of having a trial here where he might well be found guilty, now his trial will be held back in England where he will almost certainly be found not guilty. What this effectively does is that it gives these British officials here a blank check to treat us colonists any way they want without having to suffer the consequences. And so all of these together are simply intolerable. The coercive acts are known here in the colonies as the intolerable acts. Same thing. Because we say, this is intolerable. You can't do this. We refuse to comply. So, to the folks here in the colonies, we're given those dirty French Catholic bastards freedom, more local control while you're taking it away from us? I don't think so. So the colonists then are going to decide on a way to protest. This brings us to the meeting of the First Continental Congress in September of 1774. So this is a direct response then to the intolerable acts, the coercive acts. The committees of correspondence send letters back and forth to each other saying every colony should send delegates to attend this Congress, this meeting in Philadelphia so that we can find a solution to these problems. Question? The meeting of the First Continental Congress. So, delegates from all 13 colonies show up. Their stated objective is to find a solution to this crisis without war, without violence. they're going to do a couple of things here. They're going to issue a document known as the Suffolk Resolves. Okay. A document known as the Suffolk Resolves. They sent it to Parliament, correct. It's a strongly worded statement to the Parliament saying, once again, you've overreached your authority. You do not have the authority to pass laws like this and expect us to comply. Now, they make an important distinction here. They tell the Parliament that we are loyal English citizens. We just happen to live here rather than back in England. Now, it's perfectly acceptable for Parliament to treat other colonies like this, but not us, because these other British colonies around the world are mostly non-English people. We say you can treat non-English people any way you want, and that's fine with us, but you can't do it to us because we are English. And it's a violation of our rights and privileges under the English Constitution. So this applies to us, nobody else. But we don't want to go to war yet. They're going to decide then the best way we can get Parliament's attention is to reinstate non-importation. That economic boycott worked against the Townsend duties. We'll try it again. And this time, we're going to not purchase any British goods in hopes of forcing Parliament to back down. Now, to enforce the boycott, this time they create a group known as the Continental Association. The Continental Association, mostly made up of members of these committees of correspondence, will take the responsibility and assume the authority for enforcing the boycott. And they'll use speech, they'll use threats of violence, perhaps even the use of violence, if necessary, to enforce this boycott. So again, you got to question, is this going to be legitimate protest or mob violence? There's no mention of rebellion in this document. Nobody wants war here. Now, the biggest challenge the Continental Congress is going to have is deciding when we implement this boycott. Do we do it before crops are harvested this year, which means we're not going to sell anything? Question. The Continental Association is going to enforce the boycott?
Yeah, but like when?
Beginning in 1774. What's going to happen here is that nobody wants this war. We've got to decide when we're going to implement this. Do we do it before the crops are sold to England, in which case nobody makes money? Do we do it after the crops are sold, which makes us money, but then kind of defeats the purpose of non-importation? Instead of England, who do we trade with? Who do we get these goods from? And so there's controversy and disputes among the delegates. This idea of a colonial unity hasn't really formed fully yet. Now, one thing to note, and Hansen talks about this in your textbook, is this idea of a continental Congress. They could have called it anything, but they specifically chose the word continental to establish this idea, this notion of unity, that we're all in this together. This isn't just a Boston thing or a New England thing. Everybody here in the British North American colonies is affected, and so we will stand in unity as a continental Congress to speak for the people. A split is going to develop now among the delegates. We're all English, but now a split develops between the patriots, they call themselves patriots or Whigs, versus the loyalists or the Tories. The patriots or the Whigs think that we should take more aggressive action. Patriots versus loyalists. Patriots think we should take more aggressive action sooner. Not necessarily war, but we should take a firmer stance. The loyalists, or the Tories, think, let's see what happens first. Let's give this a try and let England respond. In other words, they don't want to provoke Parliament into taking even greater action against the colonies. And so there's this dispute that's going to linger between the delegates. Then, the last thing they do is they agree finally, we'll try non-importation, and we will reconvene, have another meeting in May of 1775. 6 months down the road, give or take. And then reassess the situation. Decide then what we're going to do next. So, the Continental Congress disperses. Everybody goes back home, and they start telling other of their friends and neighbors and family what's going on. Now, before they can meet again, another violent event occurs, and that's the famous Battle of Lexington and Concord. The new governor of Massachusetts, an Army officer named General Thomas Gage, governor of the political system, military, this is pretty much martial law. General Gage gets information that there are a number of these Continental Congress members, these members of the Committee of Correspondence, that are in the nearby town of Concord, about 15, 20 miles away. One of the things that the Continental Congress did was to send instructions to all the towns and all of the villages to form a militia. A militia. A militia is an informal army made up of ordinary people who will respond in an emergency. They're better known sometimes as the Minutemen, ready on a minute's notice. They're not professional soldiers. They're doctors and lawyers and teachers and shopkeepers and craftsmen and farmers. A bunch of guys that have vowed and pledged to each other that if something happens to threaten our village, we will take up arms and defend ourselves. And that's what they're doing up in Concord. They've raised a militia, and they're stockpiling weapons and supplies. Meanwhile, a few miles down the road in Lexington, they're doing the same thing. Formed a militia, stockpiling weapons. General Gage gets this information about what's going on in Concord. And so on the night of April 19th, 1775, he sends a British patrol, 750 troops, to go to Concord, arrest these rebel leaders, and confiscate their supplies. This is where we bring in the famous story of Paul Revere and his midnight ride. Now, Paul Revere actually took part in this. Go back to the map for a minute. The Patriots know that the army is going somewhere, they don't know where. So they've got about 40 guys stationed around Boston here. And when they see which direction the army is going, these guys will ride through the countryside to warn people that the British army is on its way. Paul Revere didn't really warn anybody about anything that night. The legend and the poem that commemorates him says that Paul Revere, by himself, riding through the countryside, midnight, pitch black, at a full gallop on his horse. Horses don't have headlights. You don't go full speed on a horse at night. Secondly, the legend has it that Revere was shouting, "The British are coming! The British are coming!" Which in fact we know he didn't say. Because it makes no sense. Because we are British. That would be like somebody running down the hall yelling, "The Roadrunners are coming! The Roadrunners are coming!" We go, "What? We're the Roadrunners. We're here." Okay. What he was actually shouting, and what the other riders were shouting, is that the Redcoats are coming. The Redcoats being the nickname for the British Army. Either way, Paul doesn't really warn anybody that night, because before he can make his famous ride, he gets detained by British guards in Boston. And they hold him for about 2 hours questioning him before they let him go. So by the time Paul Revere gets to Lexington, the people in Lexington go, "Yeah, we know, riders have already been here." Now, if you read Paul Revere's own account of what he did that night, it's like he saved the entire world. That he and he alone saved the planet from this terrible force of the British Army. This is why we don't ever rely and put much faith in autobiographies, stuff written by the people who claim they did it, like John Smith, because they exaggerate. And we know Paul did as well. Now, what's going to happen is that the British Army, following this blue line, about dawn, approaches Lexington. And the Lexington militia, having been warned by William Dawes earlier that evening, are standing on the town square. They've got their muskets. Keep in mind that they're not professional soldiers. They're not in a formation. They're just kind of standing around with their muskets. The British Army marches in. The commander of the British Army orders the men to disperse. And the Lexington militia says, "No, we're going to stand here. What are your intentions?" We don't know exactly what happened next, but somebody fired a shot. And then, like the Boston Massacre, everybody shoots. When the smoke clears, about 9 Lexington men lay dead on the ground. Several British soldiers have been killed or wounded as well. The Lexington militia scatters out into the countryside. The army then keeps marching towards Concord. Concord, having already found out what happened a couple hours before in Lexington, is ready. They meet the British at the North Bridge. They exchange gunfire with the British for an hour or so, and then the Concord militia scatters back into the countryside, into the woods. British Army comes into Concord, finds no rebel leaders, finds no stockpiles of weapons or supplies, so they turn around and start going back to Boston. This is when the American militias now take over control of this event. After they've scattered into the countryside, all of these militiamen know that they aren't well enough trained or disciplined to go up against the British Army. So they start to fight like the Indians. They hide behind stuff. They ambush the British. So as the British are coming back along this dotted red line, from out of the woods come all of these different militiamen from all of the towns surrounding this route. And they'll hide behind trees or rocks, and as the British Army marches by, they'll boom, 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 pop off a couple of shots, and then run away, run back into the woods. Now, keep in mind that the British Army, the uniform of the day was a bright red jacket with a white bandolier across the chest in the form of an X, pretty much a target saying, aim here. And they were attacking, ambushing these British troops. They don't know where this gunfire is coming from. And they keep getting attacked as they march back to Boston. They keep getting attacked from all sides. By the time they get back to Boston, Gage has lost 250 men. What this event shows is that, now if you wrote down 250 men and you're going to memorize that, you're missing the point. What this shows is that the militias can be effective in certain situations, even though they're not trained professional soldiers. Well, Boston has become too unstable. It's not safe for the British to stay there anymore, especially a month later at the Battle of Bunker Hill. The Boston militia has taken a stand. The British attack and drive the Boston militia off, but at a great cost of casualties. Gage realizes now it's no longer safe to keep his men in Boston, so he orders the evacuation of the city. All British troops are removed from Boston. Again, it shows that these untrained militiamen can be effective to make a point when they need to. So here again, we've got some violence occurring. May, about a month after Bunker Hill, the Second Continental Congress meets. And now we're in a position to start making a break. Now this is going to happen slowly. It's not going to be a sudden thing. The Second Continental Congress meets, again with the stated objective of trying to find a solution without war. Most of the delegates are still unwilling to declare independence. And that's because they want to give this boycott more time. We've got a long history of standing up to Parliament and making Parliament back down. So many of these delegates at the Second Continental Congress are still urging calm, still urging that we wait it out and negotiate. In the background, though, there's a handful of delegates, the hardcore patriots, that are quietly saying and spreading the word that independence is inevitable, that at some point we're going to have to break from the British Empire. One of the more significant things that the Second Continental Congress does is they vote to create the Continental Army, a full-time professional military force. And they appoint George Washington as the head of the Continental Army. Again, specifically using this phrase continental to connotate, to mean unity. And the Continental Army will draw its recruits from all of the colonies. George Washington was a really good choice. He had military experience. During the French and Indian War, he served as a lieutenant in the British Army. He also had a reputation of being a good leader, a good negotiator, somebody you could trust, somebody that you'd trust your life with. And the other reason they specifically chose Washington is because he was a Southerner. He was from Virginia. Now, to us Texans, Virginia is north. Virginia is south, okay? It's a southern state. And they did this specifically to reinforce this notion that all of the colonies need to be involved. This is not just a New England thing. This affects all of us. So, to prove that point, they appoint a Southerner to lead this army. July of 75. So right after they convene, they issue a document known as the Olive Branch Petition. This phrase, offering someone an olive branch, is a traditional, going all the way back to the Greeks and the Persians, BC, a way of showing that you want to cooperate, that you're hoping for peace. So the Second Continental Congress draws up the olive branch, addresses it specifically this time to the king, not to the parliament. It's addressed to the king, and it says, "Dear King George, we are your loyal British subjects. We love you. We need your help, though. Parliament is out of control and turning us into virtual slaves of the empire. We need you to intervene on our behalf and pull Parliament back." King George gets the olive branch petition and he rips it up. He's furious. Insubordinate little you-know-whats. They can't say this. I'm their leader. I decide what happens to them. So the olive branch petition is rejected. This only builds more support among the Continental Congress delegates for independence. Now, what's going to happen next, January of 1776, a famous little booklet will be published called Common Sense. It's written by a guy named Thomas Paine. Paine is a Whig. He's sympathetic to the colonies. He's just recently migrated over here and gotten on board this patriot independence movement. And he writes this thin little book in very plain, common language, in which he makes a case that we now have no other choice than to declare independence. He bases it on John Locke's social compact. He says the king has forfeited his right to rule us because he is letting Parliament run roughshod over our rights and liberties. So he's no longer, in fact, in a position to rule us. He broke the social compact. Now, this gets widely printed and widely distributed throughout the colonies. And virtually everybody hears or reads Common Sense. It becomes the second most widely read and published book, only behind the Bible, in the colonies. Even if you can't read and write, you get the message, because it becomes customary for somebody to stand up in the taverns every night and read Common Sense aloud. So everybody gets this message, and Paine's arguments are pretty powerful. The king has forfeited his right to rule. He's now a tyrant. Our only choice is to declare independence. Now, as this filters through the colonial population, you're going to start hearing more and more calls for independence. But it's still going to take a while. Another significant change that's going to happen with the publication of Common Sense is how we colonists now identify ourselves. Through July of '75, when we sent the Olive Branch petition, we were claiming to be loyal Englishmen. Now, the king has broken the social contract. We need a new identity. If we're no longer going to be part of the British Empire, then we're no longer British. We start calling ourselves Americans. A new identity. A new way of thinking about ourselves as outside the British Empire. Now, up to now, anytime anybody in the colonies had referred to the Americans, they meant the Indians. But now we, the Patriot faction at least, takes on this idea of we're different. We're now Americans. Now, the real break then comes, of course, in July of '76, when Thomas Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence. This is going to be a formal statement to the king, to the Parliament, and to the American people about what we have decided to do. Now, I got to go outside of PowerPoint here real quick. I put up a new document on Blackboard for you. It's called the Declaration with Notes. I'd like for you to take a look at this and analyze it as a primary source document. Let's see if I can make this a little bigger here. Stop.
There's the expansion. If you just put your cursor down to the right, to the right, to the right, up there.
Oops. Didn't want that. I actually wanted it bigger than that.
Oh, you can do that, but then just zoom in. Control and plus.
That's not as easy as it sounds. I'm holding down control.
Isn't it touchscreen?
That's not working either.
Wow.
Let's just use this. The first thing and the first part of this document is the introduction. in which Jefferson explains basically if somebody's going to take drastic action, they need to explain why. So then the second paragraph, and this is the one that resonates with us today. What you probably had to memorize parts of back in grade school. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson pretty much plagiarized Locke, didn't he? But he changed a little bit. Pursuits of happiness, it's do your own thing. It means property, but it can mean more than that too. So he's trying to broaden the appeal. He's trying to broaden this concept of natural rights. And he says here in this philosophy that governments are created to secure these rights, that's the social compact, and that when this government becomes destructive or unable to preserve the people's natural rights, it's the people's duty to dissolve that government and create a new one. So, today we look at that second paragraph and think, that's what it's about. Man, it's beautiful. Okay, it's poetry. But then he gets right to it and he says, to prove this, now let me back up. He says, the history of the present king of Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. He's broken the social compact. He's become a tyrannical ruler. So, this is why we're declaring independence. And all of the delegates that are helping write this are going, come on, Tom, get to the point. Fancy language, it's beautiful, we love it, get to the point. So, Jefferson then takes the next 5 pages in the indictment. This is a criminal indictment, a list of charges against the king. Things that he's done to screw us over the past 13 years. For example, he says here, we would have to relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, virtual representation. He says here that he's dissolved our representative houses, the coercive acts, that he's forbidden us to appropriate or acquire new lands, the Proclamation of 1763. The Townsend duties made judges dependent on his will alone for their tenure of office and the amount and payment of their salaries. That's exactly what the Townsend duties was all about. So it's a line-by-line listing of all of these things that the king has done to screw us. This is what was important to the delegates and the Americans at the time. These specific reasons are why we're declaring independence, why we're breaking our relationship with England. So they say, let it be known to the world that we now stand as an independent group of states. Now, it's important to note what the Declaration does not do as well. It does not create a national government. It simply says we states, former colonies, now states, are independent of British authority, that we'll now make our own laws based on the social contract. So let me ask you this. The 1773 Tea Act, go back, look in your notes, talk to your colleagues. The 1773 Tea Act don't hear much conversation out there. Maybe the question was too easy? What did the 1773 Tea Act do? All right, we're in the red zone. Hurry up. All right, let's see what the responses were. Very good. Correct answer is B. Gave a monopoly on colonial tea sales to the East India Company, favoring those wealthy and powerful elite. So now answer this one for me. The American Declaration of Independence All right. Now, let's see what it says. Excellent. Correct answer is E, both A and D. As soon as I saw that slide, I realized I forgot to make a point. But you guys outsmarted me. That's excellent. Thank you. The point is that Jefferson didn't invent any of this stuff that he wrote. He plagiarized Locke and Paine. Okay, I said that. But he's also, even Jefferson later writes in his diary, hey, don't give me credit for writing the Declaration. All I did was to summarize some of these widely held ideas that people have and put it into a form that was easily readable. So, the correct answer is E, both A and D. Very good. That's all I got for you today. Start on chapter 6. I'll see you back on Tuesday. Have a good weekend.